The Darkness is a comic series by Top Cow Productions that started in the mid-90s. About a decade later, Majesco Entertainment obtained game rights to The Darkness and got Starbreeze Studios on the line to create a title loosely based on the series. Majesco would end up selling the rights to 2K Games only a few months before the game's production finished, then launching in June 2007. About 5 years later, a sequel would pop up by these same publishers, arguably too late for people to even care about one. I, however, did. This early 7th gen game spoke to me as a teenager who exclusively shopped at Hot Topic, craving edgy shit and not knowing better. Come on, just look at this. That's the stuff. Or at least, was the stuff. A first-person shooter made at the tail end of this genre's more innocent years. Around then, a lot of developers were still experimenting heavily with mechanics, rather than trying to emulate proven formulas they think will make their game sell more copies. The 2012 sequel sported a staunchly different style, likely due to the time-lapse and the fact that it was a completely different development team. It's not a bad game, but nearly nothing about it grabbed me like the original. So, what happened? That's what I'm here to decipher today as we go over the gameplay, style, and presentation between The Darkness 1 and 2 in order to pit them against each other. But before that, we're going to look over the humble beginnings of this modest duology. If there are any fans of the comic's full run, I just want to say one thing. I tried. I really tried reading this. I was especially interested to read issues written by Paul Jenkins, the head writer for both games based on this comic, as well as co-writer for Twisted Metal Black, a personal favorite of mine. He got into the picture a while after the series began, but to anyone that genuinely enjoys these comics, well, I'm sorry I can't share your delight. This series that started in 1996, if anything, is a testament to its time. The characters are absolutely ridiculous, especially Jackie, our esteemed protagonist. It feels like the writers are trying way too hard to make him both edgy and the most chill, laid-back guy at the same time. He's a hot-headed but slick mobster, smashing cars into his victims, but also charming with the ladies. This playboy can get any of these Rob Liefeld abominations. Yeah, the art is unremarkable at best in its original run. Of course, even as an orphan, he was a rowdy little shit that assaulted the adults. He's always been badass, sure. He happens to be related to the biggest mob family in New York, run by Frankie Franchetti, who was foretold in generic prophetic fashion that adopting Jackie would make him all-powerful. Yeah, okay. And when Jackie attains these demonic powers, he gains new abilities that come with a really awful design. His superpowers are super strength, I think. The ability to summon these annoying minions, and I guess he can't die? This comic is so abhorrent that reading it is a serious trial. It's like a shitty take on Venom, and I've got enough of those in my life. There's no depth to these characters at all. A literal demon hybrid born in hell makes for a more interesting protagonist. Anyway, someone in their right mind decided this would make for a good video game, and I'm grateful for whomever that was because they were correct. But to say The Darkness for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 is loosely based on the comic would be putting it mildly. While it does share some events from the comics, notably those done by the same writer, Paul Jenkins, anything else it takes from the original run is a few names, the logo, and the concept of a demonic entity residing inside a man that utilizes these wicked powers to tear his foes apart. Jackie is a completely different person, Jenny is a completely different person, and Paulie, I mean, he's probably like the mob heads of the same last name in the comic, but I think their depictions in the comic are considerably stock, so it's not like he was very unique to begin with. Even the minions make their way into the game, but are much more reserved than they were in the comics. There's still these weird crawlies that can talk, but are more utilitarian and don't just exist to say annoying shit and bite off dicks. They also shelved away all that occult nonsense in order to have a more focused and personal tale to tell. Not to say that stuff can't work in comics, or even video games for that matter. I just think the cult in The Darkness is boring and dumb. The game's head writer was already well versed with the comic, knowing the ins and outs of this series, along with Mikhail Secker, so I'm glad to see they knew the most rational way to go about the first game was to have the cult be completely absent. thinking about it, I'm surprised they decided to make the game a first-person shooter. With the kind of character Jackie is, wielding his darkness powers, a third-person action game or brawler seems more appropriate. Or maybe a game where you order a bunch of minions around to attack for you? Kinda like a bloody dark Pikmin. Well, the Vita already got a game like that later on, I suppose. The developers of the game went for a more grounded and believable approach. There's no cultist bullshit, no profound prophecy besides what the darkness's sweet, sweet whispers occasionally imply.
You have done well, Jackie. I was always on your side.
Guess what just did test?
You should never have been here.
Nothing that complicates the story with worthless junk. From what I've seen as well, perhaps thanks to Jenkins himself, the comics would later take notes from the game. But it still isn't that great. Jackie Estacado remains a mobster for his family in this iteration, but doesn't seem well respected among most of his peers, just the old heads that don't like what Paulie is doing with the family. Just about 3 rebels in this little story. On top of that, he isn't very talkative and keeps more to himself, as you'll come to learn. Unlike the comics, they don't just say he's antisocial and have bimbos drool over him as he's wearing designer suits 3 panels later. Even the way Jackie speaks gives you the idea that he's a quiet guy and is only assertive when he feels it's necessary.
So my suggestion is that you leave him alone and let him do his thing.
And if I don't?
Well, if you don't, I got a magic trick for you. I see you around here again, dipshit. I'll put my arm down your throat and pull a rabbit out your fucking ass.
And he, does not dress so extravagantly. Boy, let me tell ya, I laugh at how he looks now, but back then, I loved it. Getting into the gameplay, it's pretty standard at first. Shoot up fools with guns you come across, but to up the ante, you shortly discover special powers and utilize them as a means to overtake this mob army as well as clearing obstacles. Dwelling in the dark, you can unleash these demented powers on your foes and even use it as a means to sneaking up on them. Whap and grab them from afar, or absorb their life away through a black hole. This early twist makes for an immediately gripping mechanic, setting it apart from the other FPS titles at the time. There's also these war scenarios that occur throughout the main campaign. We'll discuss context later, but it's a great juxtaposition to what war-based games were like around this time. These segments are considerably slow, dismal, and even a tiny bit terrifying. This wasn't the rip-roaring good time one might expect after getting off a Call of Duty 3 session. Well, until the end, I suppose. The controls feel a bit wonky. This was still a point where a lot of developers didn't quite reach that refinement when it came to utilizing a gamepad for their first-person shooters, but it's still extremely satisfying taking out the Franchetti army, crooked cops, and war demons. At least I think they're demons, I don't know. Having these darkness powers almost makes you think you'll be able to take on these thugs from beginning to end no problem. What you'll come to learn is, while the darkness makes you powerful, it doesn't make you invincible. Health regeneration is indeed a mechanic in this game, but it only takes a handful of bullets in one instance to take you down. Even as few as 2 armed enemies can kill you quickly if you're not prepared. You gotta strategize at times, take a step back and consider what the best options might be. The abilities you have through the darkness are your best friends, so long as you know how to use them. The game also subverts certain expectations in interesting ways, especially regarding its bosses. And how is the campaign structured in this world of tiny Manhattan? Despite the linearity of the story, they provided you a world to explore. The subway stations serve as a means for you to interact with distinct folks, have a conversation, or possibly help them in their time of need, rewarding you with collectibles, many which are phone numbers. Call them on a payphone? I can only assume this game actually takes place in the 90s like the comics, since Jack doesn't seem to have a cell phone. But he does have a beeper. Through these numbers, you'll receive some really odd interactions.
Hi, this is... Is it on? Dude, was this button? No, I didn't hear the beep.
Contextually, none of this makes sense. Why would people give Jackie random phone numbers? Furthermore, why would he call them?
Sonny here. How did you get this number? What's your fucking name? Hey, pal, you better answer me right away or ugly things are gonna fucking happen to you. Hello? Hello? Oh, you're dead meat, fuckface. Hello? Who is this? Who is on the fucking line?
Who cares? These are great. More importantly, talking to these folks makes you want to know more about them, and even some of the smallest interactions add to how comfy this world feels. The melancholic music adds a lot to this feeling as well. With a plethora of big open world games that each have 1,000 NPCs I can't even begin to give a shit about, this is a vibe I appreciate much more. Some of the side missions can even be completed in different ways.
Who the fuck are you? What are you doing in my crib?
This is your crib. Now see, I heard different. I heard this was Dana's place. I want you to give me the keys.
You go and tell Dana to eat shit and die. I live here now. Didn't you hear what I said? Get lost!
Listen to me, dipshit. You're gonna give me Dana's keys, or I'm gonna take them from you.
Hey, listen. This was just a misunderstanding. Let me give you the keys and tell Dana I'm glad we worked this out, okay?
Maybe it's kind of odd for someone like Jackie to be this kind and helpful to random strangers, being in the mob while wielding these dark powers of catastrophic proportions and all. This is definitely not something the original comic run would have bothered with. But maybe this was Starbreeze's way of showing Jackie Estacado, even with the powers of the darkness in his hand, is still just a dude trying to do some good. Speaking of, what's the story? It starts out innocently enough, cops being in hot pursuit of Jackie and a couple of fellow mobsters, on his 21st birthday of all days. Although they knew these cops were supposed to be crooked, they're not the right kind of crooked, seeing as how they have full intent to kill them. What's going on? Jackie manages to shoot his way out, but not without the help of a new friend. Beautifully, or horrifyingly, voiced by Mike Patton, best known for being the lead singer of Faith No More and is well known for his amazing vocal range. He provides his voice to portray the darkness itself. He's very good at sounding scary.
Through you, I will display my power. Through you, I am born.
What begins as your run-of-the-mill mobster tale gets quickly twisted into a monster tale. Jackie learns his uncle Paulie Franchetti, leader of this mafia he's a part of, is trying to assassinate him. Jackie has no choice but to do everything in his power with these new abilities to take him down. This whole thing feels like a Goodfellas setting invaded by the Crow or Spawn. I won't go too deeply into the story, but I'll say I enjoyed it very much. This was a wild and gritty parable full of destruction, vengeance, heartbreak.
Jackie, this is not your fault.
Terror. Pain. And eventually, closure. The presentation of this story is pretty impressive. You get these simplistic but stylish loading screens where Jackie fills you in on characters or his previous experiences.
There's no explanation for what's happened to me. Maybe this place isn't a place at all. Maybe it's a state of mind. I mean, I'm supposed to be dead. I remember you. I remember the gunshot. I think I'm in hell.
If he isn't just messing around. This almost frames the whole game being a one-man play and you're part of the audience, visualizing in your own mind what Jackie's entire ordeal was like as he's telling you.
Chinatown. You're not here anymore. I'm trying to remember you, but all I get is this stupid shit. Like your wallpaper, smelling your hallway. Even my mind is fighting me.
God, I love these scenes. While the darkness may have some noticeable jank and stiltedness, which is especially noticeable in this day and age, the game oozes with style. The cool crime thriller-esque intro,
You're a dead man! You hear me? A dead man! Oh, the NYPD is behind me, Estacado! I own the NYPD!
I'm just here for the clean air and the engaging conversation.
the nightmarish slideshow you get when you reload a checkpoint, the original art pieces by real-life professional graffiti artists plastered on the walls, and of course, the hype metal tunes that bang in the background while you're tearing through these mobsters and crooked coppers.
I see you, asshole!
Unlike a lot of other FPS games that came and went with a generation's early years, these bits of style and overall artistry are what helped make The Darkness a memorable experience. Well, for me. You even get to sit down and enjoy a movie with your girlfriend as you wonder what all your actions will lead to. So much charm. Eat your heart out, Life is Strange. I'll admit, a lot of this went over my head when I first played the game back when it was brand new. I was also someone that probably would have enjoyed those awful comics as well. I was just a young teen back then, certainly not as galaxy-brained as I am now. But with that said, I feel that emphasizes how The Darkness went with a pretty admirable balance for this game's direction, where the surface level, in all its bloody and visceral goodness, has enough for young dopes like me to enjoy. But anyone looking for introspectiveness, interesting dialogue, and drama through its presentation and characters can find things to appreciate as well.
I don't think much of the redecorating job, Jackie. It's the work of Paulie's rat bastard backstabbing motherfuckers. I am glad to see you're all in one piece. That and the Chicago people. They're gonna be grateful that you protected your Aunt Sarah. They'll owe you a great debt.
You got balls, kid. You really got balls. And you got brains. Listen, me and some of the old guys, we've been talking the other day, and we were saying that someone like you with brains, balls, and respect, and someone who honors the old ways, you know what the old ways mean, don't you? Because there ain't nothing but the old ways. So what we want for you to come in and take over the family. Just for a little while.
It's not high art by any means, but you can see Starbreeze put a lot of care into how they wanted to tell this story that could have easily been uninteresting and forgettable. The closing act is also a sight to behold, as it's a culmination of everything the creators thought of Jackie and his demonic abilities. It kind of feels like Carrie, especially if you consider how the main character is the one causing this living nightmare, and while the victims are far from innocent, you find yourself in a state of terror witnessing the massacre.
No, I show you now.
It should be right only.
Jackie's fate in the ending is left obscured, but the story ties together in a very satisfying and heartfelt manner. Was a sequel assured? Hell, was it even warranted? The game was fairly successful, breaking 1 million copies in sales, and it was well received in the sea of critics. Regardless, there were no immediate plans to expand on this reimagined world at first. Once 2K Games were keen on making a sequel to The Darkness, Starbreeze had no interest in the project, according to members of the original team. In fact, the first game's producer, Lars Johansson, art director Jen Mathias, and designer Jens Anderson left Starbreeze shortly after the title's launch to form Machine Games. They would work with Bethesda to create Wolfenstein: The New Order with the help of The Darkness programmer Magnus Hogdahl. Hogdahl? This explains why among the world of ho-hum shooters of the 8th generation, The New Order stood out really well for me. Good on them. They even got back Dwight Schultz to voice their main villain again.
You? I've seen you before. Oh, I like you. Such a resilient specimen. With you, I could do great things. You know, you've been a pain in my ass since the day I met you, Jackie. Pissing and moaning about the way I do business. Well, you need to learn who's calling the shots in this family.
Nothing has changed for 30 years. No matter how many times you try, the result will be the same.
Meanwhile, anyone left at Starbreeze was too busy working on Syndicate. 2K Games would leave the responsibility of this barely anticipated installment to Digital Extremes, which at the time, their claim to fame was Bioshock 2's multiplayer. The Darkness 2 would be left with new designers, new programmers, and an entirely new cast of voice actors. Well, except Mike Patton. Seriously, there's no replacing him.
Take the siphon. Give me its power.
Paul Jenkins returned as head writer as well, but co-writer Michael Secker did not. Something every player of the original game noticed immediately is this sequel's visuals. After how photorealistic they tried to make the characters look in The Darkness 1, which was impressive for 2007, fans were turned off by this color-popping art style with cel-shaded graphics. I don't really mind the change in direction, but a lot of the visuals leave much to be desired in other ways. Not a fan of how the hair on most of the character models look either, like it's just molded onto their heads. Weirds me out the more I think about it. Speaking of, Jackie got a haircut and resembles more of his original design from the comics. Yeesh. What kind of bothers me is, even the flashback prologue cutscene that does a quick retelling of the first game depicts Jackie as always looking like this, which simply isn't true. Where's the Nathan explosion with bedroom eyes from 2007? Let's talk about the gameplay now. If you look at the background of this production, it isn't far-fetched to think the design will end up vastly different. Shootouts with yelling thugs are still as prominent, of course, but it feels like there's no real strategy this time around, especially regarding the Darkness powers themselves. It's pretty easy to heal up, and invincibility frames are aplenty. I think Jackie has more health in general too. It focuses much more on pure action than the first game. I mean, now we've got quad wielding. Really, that's what the back of the box says. It's referring to how you can hold two guns, use the Darkness powers, and do things like equip a shield and melee attack at the same time. The world itself is completely linear this time around. There isn't much to explore besides the need to find relics that they suck at hiding. In fact, the introduction even goes out of its way to destroy that same subway station you used to get everywhere and grew to love in the first game. That's just cold, guys, come on. The controls are definitely better, but part of that might just have to do with the fact that I'm using a mouse and keyboard this time. The Darkness 1 was in a weird period where some companies didn't want to provide PC versions of their games, not even first-person shooters, a genre that only benefits from the platform in regards to playability. Perhaps it was fear of mass piracy? Either way, I'm clocking headshots at relative ease this time around. As we'll get into the story, you quickly learn Jackie basically took over for the mob family after killing Paulie Franchetti at the end of The Darkness 1. He's not really that quiet guy from the first game you got to know back then either.
Hiya, Jackie. Remember us from the Candy Club? Sure he does.
Trust me, ladies. I wish I did.
I understand that a person grows and changes over time, especially after events like what he went through, probably. But something about him just isn't as likable to me.
Johnny Powell, you look like shit. You were supposed to be the expert. I paid you good money to help me figure things out, and you repaid me by skipping out in the middle of the night?
He gets angry a little too often. He never really strays from being vengeful. His inflections are completely different, and look, I get it. He watched his girlfriend get her brains blown out in front of him. And while I agree that attaining pure vengeance isn't enough to sweep all that away, the ending of the original game was nice because it really did feel like he got his moment of closure with her. It was the beginning of Jackie making peace with what happened. It's not something that had him wake up and go, wow, I'm ready to start the rest of my life, all joyous, but it was the start of a new horizon and a new outlook on life for him. So with a pretty long time lapse, you'd think that would mean he's moved on, at least a little bit. But in The Darkness 2, all he does is sulk over her from beginning to end, and his peers are too quick to go there to him. This takes place 2 years after the events of the first game. Put some flowers on your little shrine and get over it. Nah, that's mean. I shouldn't be mean to the video game characters. I watched To Kill a Mockingbird with these two, in its entirety. I'd have less of a problem with it if he ever talked about anything else. For a game that has so much dialogue, obsessing over Jenny just left a bad taste with me.
She snuck us into movie theaters, con our way into bars, whatever. And whenever we got busted, she was just as good at getting us out as she was getting us in. She could con her way out of anything. But I should have known. Luck like that can't last forever.
Her ghost is basically invading his psyche from beginning to end. It's the same problem I had with the Joker in Arkham Knight and the squabbles between Andrew Ryan and Sophia Lamb in Bioshock 2. What was once an interesting topic to me that concluded satisfactorily in a previous iteration is now outstretched and feels more like it's overstaying its welcome in the sequel. I can only guess the writers felt they couldn't move past that old centerpiece, so they're more confident with just recycling it. Andrew Ryan, the Joker, and now Jenny. Not that Jenny was a centerpiece per se, but she was a focus in the narrative. Besides that, something about it just doesn't connect with me, unlike James in Silent Hill 2 and the shadow of his wife's death looming over him. Of course, both situations aren't entirely comparable. I can't say the NPCs are nearly as interesting in this game either. The only people you interact with are employees on your payroll, your family, a crazy person, a ghost, among all of them they obviously respect you, or villains with murderous intent. No one-off civilians who may need your help, completely unaware of your status. And I can't even begin to give a shit about what these yahoos spew because I know it's just random jargon or, yeah, let's do this, Jackie, I gotta get motivated, yeah.
Let's go, Vinny.
Attaboy, Jackie. What do you say we go tweak some nipples and see what happens, huh?
Look, as much as I am a fan of these what's the matter yous and hey, I'm walking here, this is all just starting to feel too hokey. I don't know, maybe I've seen too many mobster flicks.
Hey, I gotta do some more research. Good luck in your killing spree!
Me and the boys will take him to the zoo while you're gone. Retards like the zoo.
Whoa, guys. That's, alright. Speaking of, as you progress through the story, an old callback to the original game was the scenarios Jackie goes through whenever he dies, and it's obvious that this replaces the war scenarios when you're in hell. I guess now they're ward scenarios, mental wards. Very clever, guys. This isn't necessarily bad, but I just can't really dig on this Cuckoo's Nest portion. It feels very ham-fisted, and while it is funny to see all the characters you just got to know in a completely different light, some of these setups are just dumb.
Dolfo, what the fuck's going on here?
What I really want to do is paint.
Well, not you too.
Mental note to self. Never again open up a war on two impossible fronts. And never again go within 150 miles of Moscow during the winter. Oh, and remember to buy cyanide capsules at the store.
Really? Is that the only reason he's named Dolfo? For a dumb Hitler impression? These feel more like a way for the developers to force deviation from the main story and extend its length, rather than showing any sort of progression. Until the near end, I suppose. They got rid of the charming subway that any New Yorker can swear they smell the piss when they're playing the game, and replaced it with a boring mansion full of people ready to suck you off. Although there's two side objectives, but they are pretty much alike. Shoot all the things, woohoo! But the point is, unlike the war scenarios from the first game, in which it was a way to defeat inner obstacles, inner demons, and improve upon yourself even more, this mental ward segment feels more like you just dawdle around until you go where the game wants you to. I always thought part of a game's job is to elude your mind that it's programmed in a repetitive manner for that moment when it can be apparent, usually through its scenery and atmosphere. The Darkness 1 did a decent job doing such. The Darkness 2 can't hide this nearly as well because of how much of a sudden halt this is to the core pace of the campaign. The design of the original title wasn't perfect, but at least it wasn't an entirely linear, bland, waypoint-riddled trek. The story is kind of one note, as I've discussed before. While it does add some more lore to the Darkness and its origin, the real focus seems to be Jenny, but even more so than the first game. She's apparently more important than how Jenkins made it seem back in 2007.
You will do my bidding.
Give me one good reason.
Her soul is mine. You will do my bidding!
I don't know, something about it just feels really forced. The campaign itself is also incredibly short. I remember accidentally beating the entire thing in a single sitting back when it was brand new. However, something people might miss are these side campaigns where you actually get to choose different characters, known as Vendettas. In these co-op missions, you get some stereotypes that would be more at home in a game like Punch-Out.
There's only one thing I take more seriously than my drinking, and that's my blood.
Nothing you just said makes any sense.
That's 'cause you don't know us Wilsons.
Lucky me.
We're wanderers, you see. One and all. From a first taste of old Ma's tit, till we're chugging back dirt underground. No Wilson has ever escaped this life, untraveled.
That doesn't really explain how you came here unknowingly.
But would you believe me if I said I was really drunk?
Yes, I think I would.
Up to 4 players can play, overbearing the enemy AI with relative ease, softlock the mission from time to time, and eventually reach what is a unique final boss. Unique to the main campaign, that is. Throughout these vendettas, you get a little more information of what was going on between Jackie's main missions and the cult known as the Brotherhood, who stop at nothing to take down Jackie. They don't serve as very interesting antagonists, and you only learn more about them through completely optional lore from narrated descriptions in the relics. I don't really have a problem with that. There's plenty of games where the story is presented in similar ways. I just think it's a poor sense of direction, seeing as how most of the dialogue in the main campaign was focused on Jackie being obsessed with Jenny, rather than this brotherhood or Jackie's own thoughts on things that aren't related to Jenny. Not that I wanted it to be primarily about the cult, because these goons don't have much depth in their design or personality either, which makes it more annoying that they replace the entire enemy lineup shortly after things get started. I guess what I'm trying to say is the occult lore is more interesting than the cult itself, and I'm positive most people didn't even know all this existed.
What you're holding is the very first artistic interpretation of the darkness. Or as it was known then, he who comes with the night. Not the catchiest of names, but pretty good when you consider that most people are still living in caves. Anyway, at this point in history, Cain, you know, Adam's son, as in the Garden of Eden, first guy to ever walk the earth, Adam, had dealt with most of the demons and assorted nasties that still roam the world. But no one had faced the darkness yet. See, God protected Cain from the darkness by making him unkillable. It was a great plan. If you happen to be Cain, everyone else, not so much.
A very direct comparison between these two games would be their conclusions. Amidst this wave of nightmarish terror you cause on Franchetti's army at the end of the first game, it ends somewhat anticlimactic since all you do is chase Paulie up some stairs and finish the job. Once you tear down his wave of mobsters, he's just another person after all. The Darkness 2, you're in this purple hellscape killing all these flesh-toned demons that are just reskins of human enemies, all while attempting to free Jenny's soul from these shackles. I don't know, it just feels less rewarding to me. Probably because this occurs after fighting what I consider the final boss, so this last ordeal feels deflated. It doesn't have a way to connect with anybody, there's no payoff left to be had. At least not for someone who's sick of this Jenny obsession. The closing piece to the first game was very peaceful and had some downcast to it, but aims to fill the player with a bit of content. Sure, this is something Jackie would have wanted to last forever, but he knew this was his chance to close the book on his lost love and make peace.
You have to wake up now. Wake up.
The song creeping in as the credits roll was also a nice touch, adding to the emotional nature of it. Even if this kind of music isn't your thing, it's difficult to deny how heartfelt it is for the moment. The Darkness 2 ending is basically,
we now have the ghost of your girlfriend to do our bidding and trap you here in hell. See you in the sequel, that'll never happen.
It's aggressively schlocky and kind of tasteless. And don't get me started on the Angelus. I've hated on the source material enough. I'm not crazy about the new voice actors either. Of course, I imagine 2K didn't want to rehire the array of TV and movie actors they got for the first title, or it's possible they just weren't interested in reprising those roles 5 years later. However, I think this change shows a great divide in presentation between the two games. I'm not even going to say what kind of actor has the easier or more demanding job, because I don't actually know. But if there's one thing I'll say about performance, actors from these two fields respectively will execute the same job differently. I think the live-action actors who took on their roles had a better understanding of not sounding like a caricature of Italian Americans on Nickelodeon. They knew how to make their inflections a bit more humble, a bit more subtle, such as Kirk Acevedo as Jackie.
They weren't inside my mind. I was inside the mind of the darkness.
Mike Starr as Butcher Joyce.
You beat Paulie's guys, and he's not a good loser. Now, I wouldn't put it past him to throw Eddie Schroed on your ass.
Kirk Baltz as Anthony.
I know there are a lot of things you're not gonna understand, but you gotta trust me. Now that you've arrived, I think we're gonna find out what's happening here.
And Alex Mann as Jimmy.
Let me tell you something. I've seen this shit happen time and time again ever since that fat fucking Paulie took over the mob. You understand? He's doozy bots. He's out of his fucking mind.
Notice that none of them have a record of cartoons or video games to really speak of. It's surprising that they signed up for the Darkness 1 in the first place. They must have been impressed by how Starbreeze presented themselves and their game. Or the money was right. Meanwhile, the Darkness 2, everyone just talks like a cartoon character.
The assholes who hit us are hiding out at the Brimstone.
What did you geniuses find out?
It was Eddie who heard it. I was otherwise engaged at the time.
He was busy snorting coke off a hooker's ass.
Never could multitask.
Well, these two chuckleheads are getting their dicks spit polished. One of the whores starts running her mouth about the new owners.
They're not necessarily bad performances, I just don't think any of them knew how to go for that humble feel that the voices provided in the original game. It harms that sense of immersion for me because they don't sound like real people for even a second. Just characters, if that makes sense. It felt like Tony Pajamas could come out at any second.
Oh, listen, I didn't have any dinner tonight.
Yeah?
And it was to my understanding there was gonna be food backstage.
Uh-huh.
Well, there wasn't any. I'm starving over here. Could you get me like a sandwich or something?
Props to David Hoffman, though. His performance as Johnny Powell was great, and it's safe to say he had more lines than anyone else in the game.
Jackie, let's take a step back here, okay? Let's think about this. So, what if she isn't even real? The darkness plays tricks on you, huh? And makes you see things.
Speaking of sounds, no death metal. None. I'm not even a fan of the genre, I'm just surprised. This really boggled my mind because The Darkness 2 tries to be much more vicious and bloody than the first game, so I'm astounded that not a single track goes for that cheesy, dirty metal vibe when you're tearing through your enemies. For those wondering, the Darkness 2 soundtrack consists of a bunch of licensed tracks in which only like 2 of them are noticeable and a bunch of generic orchestra. It's time I get into some finer details of why I didn't like the Darkness 2 as much as the first game. Or as a lot of people like to put it, nitpicking. With your 2 tentacle friends back in action, I like that their appearances have been differentiated between each other, but they're kind of scrawny now, like 2 noodles with teeth. I like the detailed muscles on their bodies in the first game, it made them appear more threatening, and the light patterns in their skin changing depending on what ability you have equipped, very stylish. Eating hearts isn't as satisfying this time around. While it can be convenient that the animation is quicker and you can even interrupt it if need be, I kinda miss the visceral appeal this command had in the first game. It was so juicy and meaty. In The Darkness 2, I'm not sure what those loud thuds are supposed to be. I just don't get as much out of it. The executions are fine on their own, but what's funny is that they're animated in a completely different plane of existence. In other words, they depend on forced perspective in hopes that nothing nearby obscures it. The illusion doesn't break often, but when it does, it's a beautiful thing. Something else that bugged me? No legs. I can't see myself when I look down, making it more obvious that I'm just 2 arms and a camera. Probably the biggest nitpick, but it never ceases to annoy me in first-person shooters. Some of the in-game cutscenes even showed Jackie's legs, so this is only more baffling. Look, he's sitting down on his chair, but you can't see his legs at all.
Those are some nice shoes. Are those Belutis?
Now this dialogue is just dumb. Who wouldn't look down when they hear this line?
I wouldn't stay here for too long, son. I like your shoes.
That's more like it. Oh man, they don't have those ghoulish slideshows when you reload a checkpoint anymore. Now it's just clips of the cutscenes. That's so lame.
The darkness will return!
After these messages. The darkness itself sounds a little too angry and grody.
Embrace the darkness, Jackie.
My friend!
Mike Patton still did a pretty good job with the voice, but something about it just doesn't seem as creepy. It doesn't have that same under-your-skin feel.
I fixed your broken head, ball. You have passed my test. No more dreaming.
The font doesn't look as unique either. Is it petty to complain about font choice? Probably.
Hello, monkey! It's been too long! Give us a hug!
Been too long? You weren't in the first game. Where's Richard Horvitz? Not really a fan of this English gremlin that follows you around. The linearity of this game is exposed most blatantly with him. He replaces the Darkling spawn mechanic of the old game where you can summon 4 different kinds of your choosing. Now it's like you always have a berserker with you. But he also feels the need to show you the trail he's programmed to follow and pester you if you're not making progress immediately.
Can we go tear someone apart now?
Shut up. I'm trying to explore and take in the atmosphere. The enemies in general aren't nearly as interesting either. Both games share this non-issue of hearing the same lines spouted over and over again. That's not something I'll really complain about much, but the original game's devs took some leaps here and there to make them more interesting, even if it isn't that noticeable.
Over the radio?
I said fucking maintain radio silence!
Are you really that stupid? If you maintain radio silence, you're not supposed to tell everybody over the radio. Moron.
How the hell else would I say it?
Try semaphore. Now shut the fuck up.
The Darkness 2 didn't really bother trying to give the player those unique little moments. I kind of don't like how they completely remove the ability to retreat the darkness at any point in the game on your own. It only happens automatically when you're getting blinded by a light structure or in a non-action scenario. I feel like this little change is a great testament to what these new devs assumed the original game was all about. The way the darkness is designed in the first game gave you a sense of strategy. Hearing them cook tells you you're not in an ideal place at the moment, but can still use their abilities in a pinch if need be. In 2, they make it so that any light will render them completely useless, blind you, and yell at you in ear-ringing fashion to change the surrounding environment as quickly as possible.
I need the dark!
It's more streamlined and obvious for the player. This makes it much more imperative that you take out any lights that you can, even a little bulb, get rid of it. Otherwise the game won't let you see 2 inches in front of your own face. They took this original mechanic and made it obtusely annoying. The Darkness 1 had pure savagery as part of its formula, I'm obviously not going to deny that, but the way Starbreeze established the world in their quiet New York town with unique art pieces, humble characters who even sometimes get overtaken by the environment around them from time to time, it felt a little more genuine. Even if no public part of Manhattan is this spacious and empty. I can't really take much from The Darkness 2. Nothing looks that unique. Nothing really leaves an impression. Just constant streets, alleys, and barely furnished buildings. Even Jackie's own mansion doesn't have anything intriguing to look at either, in my opinion. It felt like Digital Extremes was not that interested in the idea of world building, at least not in the same way the old folks at Starbreeze did. So with all that said, do I hate The Darkness 2? Absolutely not. While I've been tearing into it plenty, I'm not going to deny the highlights. Even with keyboard and mouse being an option, I think they made the character movement much smoother than the first game. I like the co-op missions. They're interesting little bits that add to the main story, even if it does feel kind of shoehorned and convoluted. I was happy to see that the characters do play noticeably different from Jackie as well. I also like the cel-shaded art style. While there are textures that leave much to be desired, it shows considerably less signs of aging than other games at the time, thanks to its artistry. The executions are also fun to see, even if they get a little bit stale after a while. Perhaps 2 or 3 more for each style would have helped matters a bit, but they're still nicely done. I think Digital Extremes wanted to make sure The Darkness 2 was a step above the first game at a technical standpoint, if nothing else. And they succeeded in that regard. Not to say The Darkness 1 is unplayable, but jumping from one game to the next shows a significant difference. They were able to iron out those bits of jank. I just think The Darkness 1 had much more interesting story and charming atmosphere, supported by its characters, appropriately muggy environment, and slightly deeper gameplay mechanics. It should go without saying at this point that I highly recommend people play The Darkness 1, but what really sucks is the opportunity to play it just gets smaller and smaller for folks. The game was never ported to consoles outside of the 7th generation, nor did it receive a PC version. While The Darkness 2 is also just part of the 7th generation, its PC version makes it much more accessible for new people to give a try. Even on Windows 10, runs perfectly fine. I think this is why players tend to steer towards The Darkness 2 as well. A lot of people seem to have played it without even giving a glance at the first title. There's always discussion to be had about PC versions of games, and I don't want to sound like some elitist jerk who thinks everything needs to be on PC. Hell, I've been playing more games on Switch than anything else lately. The thing is, game preservation and accessibility seems much more likely for games that receive PC versions. If The Darkness 1 did receive a PC release back in the day, chances are it'd be ready and available on Steam for you to quickly download and get to playing in moments, even if you have the latest hardware. And if it wasn't compatible with the latest operating systems, I wouldn't doubt some hardcore Darkness fans will finagle a fan patch or short instructions to make it run perfectly fine. PC is a platform that is constantly evolving, but rarely seems to hinder the opportunity for older games to be completely playable and forever cherished on it. Meanwhile, as soon as a console reaches a new generation, so many gems of the previous fall on the wayside, unless the owners of the IP take the time to remaster or port it, like years and years later. Granted, the likes of Microsoft put a great effort into making many Xbox 360 and even original Xbox discs run on their latest hardware. Backwards compatibility as a whole has become much more of a second thought than ever before. At least, that was the case for this current generation. The only other option I can imagine is modding the console itself, which many don't when it's a part of the current generation. And emulation? Well, PlayStation 3 emulation is finally starting to get off the ground, but that console is more than a decade old at this point. Just to give you an idea of how long it could take to make this a viable option. It might be weird bringing up the topic of game preservation with something that barely has recognition to begin with, like The Darkness, but it's one of the many cases where I wish these games got a little more attention, but being tied to older consoles keeps it from getting out there for a potential new audience. And that's all I have left to say about both titles. And what about the prospects of a third game? It's hard to say if 2K will ever be interested in pursuing that. But Darkness 2 undersold significantly, a good chunk less than the original. I feel like a February release date for a game that isn't high profile doesn't stand much of a chance. Starbreeze appears to be active, mostly helping Overkill with the titles they develop, as well as even publishing games themselves. While Machine Games is still around, working on Wolfenstein, some of the particular devs behind The Darkness went the indie route to work on smaller games, since they apparently got burnt out of AAA high-budget titles. As for Digital Extremes, they went on to make Warframe shortly after The Darkness 2, and that free-to-play game is still booming to this day across the world. Who knows how much longer that'll be active for. In all honesty, if 2K Games were ever to want The Darkness 3 to happen, chances are it'll be a whole new team yet again. Seeing as how both games have their absolute strengths, I'd like to see a new game that takes a little from both. Give me that tightly designed gameplay that feels good to movie and shooty. And don't forget to glaze the adventure with charm and unique design. Make sure that presentation is tip-top. Then, I think you'll have a really nice game in your hands that can live up to fans of either titles. However many are left. Thanks for watching. Big shout out to my lovely patrons for voting on this video to be my latest side project. If you want to get in on the voting process, there's a new poll happening right now. I'd also like to welcome a new Baron of Brutality known as Burn the Brew. Burn the Brew, Baron of Brutality. Jesus Christ. Despite how many B's are in that name, you're an A+ to me. If you'd like to support my channel, consider visiting my Patreon page and maybe join my Discord to chat with me about finer things in life, like chickens or spacecrafts.
Bro, やつの意志を引き継ぐ悪魔やつ持つ心臓闇のヒーロードクロのジョンソンエイトヘッドの登場 Yo 7つの弾丸